Greetings and welcome to this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. My name is Joe Rubenstein and it is Wednesday, July 11th. And as I record this before the final game in Baltimore as the Yankees try to somehow manage a split against the awful Orioles, two things are true, one good, one bad. Number one, the Yankees are 28 games over 500. Number two, if they continue to play the way they've played the last 2 weeks, they will not win this division. The kind of record that we've compiled may have been good enough almost any other season, but the truth is the Red Sox are beating the teams they're supposed to beat. In fact, they're sweeping them for the most part, and we are not. We have just too many losses against bad teams, and there's been way too many times, way too many, where we take the first 2 games of a series only to come out flat and drop the third game. And this pattern has largely escaped scrutiny because we've won so many series, but dropping very winnable games against bad teams has been a problem. And, yes, we have key members injured, and that's not nothing. Glaber is out, Sanchez is out, but it's not an excuse either. I mean, it happens to every team. So, no, I'm not saying the sky's falling, and, 3.5 games out of first on July 11th does not mean we have no chance to win this division. Obviously, it means we have a good chance. But if we continue to put forth these inexplicably flat performances every 2 or 3 games, especially against bad teams, it's going to be a wild card game in early October, win or go home. You can follow us on Twitter at Bombers Podcast is the handle. You can also send us questions. We'll try to answer each and every week in our mailbag segment here on the podcast. You can like us on Facebook, subscribe to our show on iTunes or Stitcher. We're on Spotify as well, or give us a call, 646-854-4959. And as always, you can send your comments and questions to joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com. Really, however you'd like to engage with us, we love engaging with you. Coming up a little bit later on in our Twitter poll this week, your thoughts on whether the Yankees should trade Clint Frazier, Domingo Germán, and Brandon Drury for a 2-month rental of Manny Machado and closer Frazier-Britton of the Orioles. Also, I'll answer a fascinating question from one of our followers about whether Major League Baseball should institute new rules to limit defensive shifts, and we'll go through the good, the bad, and the ugly from this last week of action. All that and more coming up on today's Bronx Bombers. Back in a moment.
Bronx Bombers Trivia. Which of these 4 players gave Reggie Jackson the nickname Mr. October in 1977? Was it A, Willie Randolph, B, Thurman Munson, C, Goose Gossage, or D, Mickey Rivers? The answer coming up a little bit later in the podcast.
And now here's Joe with this week's main thing.
So just a quick note, we're going to be taking a 1-week hiatus during the All-Star break. So no episode next week. The next episode after this one drops on July 25th. And beyond that, for the remainder of the summer, we're going to be releasing episodes once every 2 weeks. And the reason is simple. I'm working 2 jobs this summer, so basically all my days and nights are taken up, on top of which I'm in the early stages of putting together a second podcast, a very ambitious project, which I'll be talking about more in the fall. So there may be individual game reactions that will release in the off weeks, but at least until the end of August, we'll have a new full episode every 2 weeks. And while we're on the subject, I want to take this opportunity to just tell you how pleased we are at the continuing growth of this podcast. When I started this, we were getting, 50 or 60 downloads per episode. Well, after only a few months, we're up to 500 per episode. That's amazing growth, and that's something that we're really proud of, and it's thanks to you. I want to thank all of you for listening, for writing to me, for tuning in every week and helping us keep this thing going. All right, so back to baseball, and Masahiro Tanaka, who started last night's walk-off loss to the Orioles, was, he was good. He was Tanaka. He was good in spots, but certainly not good enough. Lots of hard contact, and he ends up giving up 3 runs in just 4 1/3 innings, and the 4th inning is what killed him. 30 pitches, including a 2-run double to Joey Rickard. That inning was extended, by the way, by a very costly error by Miguel Andujar. They probably should have sent somebody in for Tanaka in the 5th, seeing seeing as how he's coming off that injury, but they send him out there, and Machado jumps on the very first pitch and ties the game. Machado, he has just been wearing Yankee pitching out all year. I mean, really beyond this year, but just the second player in Major League history with at least 4 multi-home run games against the Yankees before the age of 27. The other was Double X, Jimmy Fox. And Machado has 20 home runs versus the Yankees since 2015. 5 more than any other player in that span. And the Orioles, the worst team in the majors, are now 5-4 against the Yankees, whereas their record against all the other teams with records over 500 is 9-36. And, not to pile on here with all the gloom and doom, but this inability to consistently put away bad teams has been a hallmark of this Yankee club for the past few years, really, and the primary reason why we end up in second place so often. But the good news, starting on the mound tonight, Sonny Gray. Wow, that's not good news at all. And I fully expected Sonny to pitch well in Toronto after I shellacked him last week, but man, he was terrible. And we'll get to that. But, it all points back to the Yankees needing, starting pitching, desperately needing starting pitching, because it's not just Gray. We have no one truly reliable other than Severino and Sabathia. And, CC could blow out a knee any second. You just don't know at 38 years of age. So on that somber note, let's get into the good, the bad, and the ugly as we take a hard look at the Yankees' individual performances and see who made the grade and who did not. The good is headlined by Mr. Brett Gardner, who's been just a man on a mission this week. Absolutely crushed a ball in Camden Yards on Monday in the first game of that doubleheader split. That was 426 feet, that home run. The longest home run by Gardy since StatCast tracking began in 2015, and he just had a great week, hitting .310 with 2 home runs, a double, a triple, 2 walks, and 7 RBIs. He's had kind of an up-and-down year, which is to be expected, I guess, from a 34-year-old, but he's given us very, very good value since May, and he had the game-winning RBI in Sunday's game in Toronto. Also good was Domingo Germán, whose name has surfaced in trade talks as a possible piece in a deal for Manny Machado. Germán gave up just 1 run and 4 hits over 6 innings in Toronto. And what I really liked, besides those numbers, is he showed in one spot there in the 4th inning, he showed real composure and the ability to work himself out of a jam. He issued back-to-back walks to Russell Martin and Randall Grichuk to load the bases, but then he beat Lourdes Gurriel, striking him out on a very nasty curveball. So he's a guy who's continued to show that he belongs in the major leagues. 3 hitters that contributed this week are Didi, Judge, and Stanton, each with 4 RBIs, but Judge continues to be a Jekyll and Hyde player to a large extent. At home, he's an absolute force. But on the road, his home-away splits are pretty mind-boggling. He's hitting .355 at home, .206 on the road, on-base percentage .478 at home, .309 on the road, 43 RBIs at home, 17 on the road, 17 home runs at home, 8 on the road. So we had a reverse situation with Stanton the first few months of the season where, he was playing terribly at home but well on the road. That seems to have fixed itself, but it's unclear to me why Judge continues to struggle on the road, but it's a fact. And finally, Adam Warren makes our good section. It's been a tough year for Warren. And, he had that back injury early on, and it seemed to take him a while to get it together. But he looked great in relief of Germán on Sunday, and this week gave up only 2 hits, no earned runs, and had 3 strikeouts. Bad this week, I'd have to go with the aforementioned Masahiro Tanaka, who has a real gift for giving up dingers. He's given up 18 this season now. And Masahiro, he's not having a very good year. He's very capable of going out there and giving you some strong innings, but there invariably comes a point where he falls apart, and he has a 4.68 ERA to show for it. Ugly this week, for the second week in a row, and for at least the 5th or maybe the 6th time this season, was the performance of Sonny Gray in Toronto, which was beyond hideous. He looked like a total deer in the headlights, and I talked last week about the Sonny Gray experience where he teases you with a quick 2 outs in the first and then falls apart, and that came very close to happening again. He got those 2 outs and he loaded the bases, but then he got out of it. But the second inning was, that was perhaps the worst inning by any Yankee pitcher this season. season, where Sonny gave up hit after hit, and just to keep it interesting, he served up 2 wild pitches and a hit batsman as well. The big crusher was Justin Smoak's 3-run home run, and what was truly alarming is, most of Gray's horrific outings this season have come against, pretty good teams, but the Blue Jays don't remotely qualify as good, and Gray, in his 7 other starts in Toronto, had a 1.88 ERA. So this is a disaster in slow motion, Sonny Gray's season. And, again, I'm recording this before his start in Baltimore, so maybe he goes out there and pitches well, maybe he doesn't. But, he continues to demonstrate the strong possibility, the likelihood, in fact, that he is simply unable to pitch well with any kind of consistency in a New York Yankees uniform. The runner-up to our good section is Luis Cessa. He pitched an absolute gem in the second game of that doubleheader on Monday, and it really showed why the Yankees have maintained faith in him and given him so many chances. He was just phenomenal. He pitched a 3-hitter in 6 innings, and his reward, a trip back to AAA to open up a roster spot for Tanaka. But, I have a feeling that given our continuing pitching troubles, that we'll see Luis Cessa again before the year is done. Back in a moment.
And now the answer to today's Bronx Bombers trivia question. Which player gave Reggie Jackson the nickname Mr. October in 1977? The answer? B. Thurman Munson. And now here's Joe with this week's Twitter poll.
Yes, this week's Twitter poll results are in. We asked you this. Would you trade Clint Frazier, Domingo Germán, and Brandon Drury for a 2-month rental of Manny Machado and left-handed closer Zach Britton? And those specific names were being speculated on by Jim Duquette of Sirius XM's MLB Network Radio. Where he got those names, I have no idea, but it seemed like a reasonable package for the purposes of this poll. So Frazier-Germán-Drury for Machado-Britton of the Orioles. And the rumors have been flying about Cashman's sudden interest in Machado. So 46% of our followers on Twitter at Bombers Podcast said yes, do the deal. 29% said no, and 25% said only if we also add a starting pitcher. And I added that third option because, on the face of it, this particular trade with the names I mentioned does not make a great deal of sense to me from the perspective of the Yankees' needs right now, especially given the fact that Machado has been adamant in recent interviews that he's a shortstop and only wants to play shortstop. And look, Didi is not Machado. We all know this. We sort of let ourselves dream that maybe that was the case back in April, and his numbers then at least matched Machado's, actually exceeded Machado's for a while, but the earth tilted back into its normal axis, and now Didi's hitting 255 to Machado's 309. Didi has 15 home runs, Manny has 21. Didi has 48 RBIs, Manny has 60. And that's on a crappy team, by the way, where guys just don't get on base a whole lot. And Didi's OPS on base plus slugging is 775, and Manny's is 934. That's elite. So if you trade for him, then what do you do with Didi exactly? You can't send him to the minors, so the only halfway sensible answer is to go with option C and package Didi for a starting pitcher. Here's the problem. There aren't really any great starting pitchers on the market as we speak, and all of them seem to be in the final year of their contracts, so you'd be trading away a very high-quality player in Didi Gregorius for a rental of who? Jay Happ? Cole Hamels? That doesn't sound like very good value to me. And with Britton, who hasn't been any great shakes for Baltimore this season, an upgrade over Chase and Shreve as far as a lefty out of the pen, definitely. But to me, Clint Frazier, Domingo Germán, and Brandon Drury, that's a lot of value right there. When you look at their upside and how long the Yankees would have, control over them for very low cost, especially the first two. And again, this is for a 2-month rental. What happens if, God forbid, the Yankees, lose in 5 in the opening round to Boston? Let's be honest here, it's not exactly inconceivable. So what would happen is we'd lose Machado and Britton to free agency, and we would have also lost the services of a very talented young outfielder with a great attitude in Clint Frazier, a developing talent with a live arm in Domingo Germán, and a very serviceable utility infielder in Drury. You place any one of those guys' names next to Machado, it sounds great, right? You do it in a second, but, all three? I wouldn't sign off on that unless we do make that second deal for a starting pitcher, and that pitcher is like a Bumgarner or a DeGrom or a Syndergaard, someone we'd have in our rotation for more than 2 months. As great as Machado is, he doesn't really feel like an obvious need for us right now. I mean, if Cashman is dead set on signing him, do it in November when he's a free agent. That way you can kind of figure out what to do with Didi and restructure the roster in a measured way. But for right now, focus on pitching, man. I mean, anybody who's been watching these games knows that we've got, Severino, we've got a very game but 38-year-old Sabathia, and a bunch of question marks in our rotation. And our bullpen has showed some weakness lately as well. So focus on pitching. Pitching wins championships. Believe it. All right, from this week's mailbag, our question of the week here on Bronx Bombers comes from Troy in Roslyn. And by the way, the email is joe@bronxbomberspodcast.com, or you can find us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle, or give us a call at 646-854-4959. If you have any questions you want to have us answer on any future episodes, we are more than happy to do so. And Troy writes, recently there's been some talk that Major League Baseball might outlaw or at least modify teams' ability to use defensive shifts. What do you think of the shift? Should teams be allowed to do it or not? Well, thanks for that question, Troy. It's a very good one, almost too good. I mean, of all the questions I've gotten, this may be the most difficult to answer because there are fairly compelling arguments on both sides. So Troy is right. Commissioner Rob Manfred said recently, quote, I think we want to proceed judiciously to limit shifts, but I also think we want to proceed, unquote, meaning we'll do something but not ban them entirely. So for anyone who watches baseball at all, it won't come as any surprise that defensive shifts are the new normal. I mean, every team does it, and the reason is that they are effective. They've proven to be effective, and the Yankees, by the way, have employed them brilliantly. There's a stat to measure defensive runs saved due to shifts. Don't ask me how they come up with it, but they do, and the Yankees are second on that list with 23 defensive runs saved this season due to shift. Only the Rays have more with 24. Now, the purist argument, the kind of philosophical stance that the game was quote-unquote meant to be played with two infielders on either side of second base, I don't buy that exactly. Infielders were placed there because presumably it offered the best protection against ground ball base hits. And of course, back in the day, they didn't have our access to stats on each hitter via computer analysis, which isn't to say that there weren't shifts on individual players in the old days. I mean, the Cardinals famously shifted on Ted Williams for all 7 games of the 1946 World Series, and it was very effective. He only hit, I think, 200 and 0 extra base hits in that series. So the point of defense in baseball is to prevent runs from scoring, and the shift certainly accomplishes that task better than maintaining identical positioning for every hitter. On the other hand, there's the baseball is entertainment argument. And we all know that rules have certainly been changed in the past for the purposes of boosting offense. When averages plummeted in the 1960s, Major League Baseball lowered the mound, and all of a sudden the averages were spiking up. And certainly the DH rule, the motivation there was more offense as well. People like to see hits. That's why they tune in, and they don't tune in to see ground balls into the shift. And these shifts, again, make it very tough on hitters, especially when you're in a situation today where almost every pitcher can throw 95 with movement. So the deck has been stacked against hitters in the past 7 or 8 years with the natural evolution of pitching and the shift. And you might ask, well, why don't hitters bunt more often or try to hit the ball to where the shortstop would normally be when teams shift to the right side? And there's multiple reasons for that. First of all, you don't necessarily want good hitters bunting all the time. They're not really used to doing it. They're not that good at it. And, just the other day you had Matt Adams of the Nationals bunting against the vacant left side of the infield, and he broke his finger. But, more importantly, what makes things difficult for hitters when they've got to shift, let's say, to the right side, pitchers use that. If the left side of the infield is totally uninhabited, pitchers are not going to pitch soft stuff away to a left-handed hitter. They're going to bust him inside. Very tough to pull that. So one obvious solution, of course, is to hit the ball out of the ballpark. But not every hitter has consistent power, although more and more do. So look, there's good arguments for both sides. But if I was forced to come up with a position on this, which apparently I am, having been asked this question, then I would say let it be. Let hitters adapt. Again, this is a fairly new phenomenon. The constant shifting is really only 7 or 8 years old, and it's tough to forbid teams from doing something that's fundamentally sound strategy just because it's sound strategy. It's a drag that it depresses offense, which is why I do think Manfred will limit it in some way. Major League Baseball is a business after all, and again, fans aren't tuning in to see ground balls into the shift. But if it was up to me, Troy, I would hold off for now. See if hitters find ways to evolve and beat the shift more consistently, and if not, then maybe you look at it. I mean, I guess the bottom line for me is I don't like the idea of legislating against a given, legal strategy because that strategy happens to be effective. It's almost like you're mandating bad thinking in a way. So I'd stick with the shift for now. But again, it looks like Manfred is at least in the preliminary stages of enforcing some kind of limitations on it. So we'll see where it goes. But thanks a lot for that question, Troy. I really appreciate it. And that'll do it for this week's episode of Bronx Bombers. Again, don't forget, you can subscribe to this podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Find us on Spotify. Follow us on Twitter @BombersPodcast is the handle. Like us on Facebook as well. But most of all, have faith in the Yankees. We'll see you in 2 weeks.